Hi, everybody. This is Kate Haley with Glazer's Camera here in Seattle, Washington. And thank you so much for joining us for this fun-filled session on not just photography, but really we're going to dive into the world of Sony Alpha cameras. We're going to talk a little bit of tech. We're going to let you guys ask some questions. We're going to talk about some of the new cameras that are on the market right now, including the one that was just announced this week. So exciting times in the world of Sony, as always. I mean, Sony often has new things happening, and it's always an exciting time with them whenever you see announcements from them. On the line with us today, we have Sarah Regnier, and I'm probably totally murdering your last name, and Hector Parayuelos, well, also butcher that last name. So basically, this format's going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be really presentation-driven. We've got some conversation points and some questions I'm going to ask these guys. But for those of you tuning in, we want to hear questions from you as well. So don't be shy. If you have a question about Sony gear, cameras, lenses, flashes, accessories, all that good stuff, this is a great opportunity to post those questions in the comments on our Facebook page, in the live feed, or on our YouTube feed. That way, I'll be monitoring those questions and asking Sarah and Hector the questions that you guys submit. And like I said, we have a little bit to get us started. Now, before we get into the Q&A, I'd love for Sarah and Hector to just take a moment to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about what they do with Sony, and maybe share one tidbit about photography and why they love photography. So, Sarah, let's start with you.
Pressure's on. Hi, everyone.
Yep.
I'm Sarah Regnier. I'm the account manager for the Northwest at Sony, and I've actually been a photographer for over 20 years now. I have a background in photojournalism and wedding photography, and I do quite a bit of pet photography now. So now I kind of love my favorite thing is kind of capturing all of the pets' emotions and what have you.
And you have two dogs that you love dearly who have their own pretty fabulous Instagram feed, as I recall.
Yes.
So you might see some dogs along the way today. I'm sure most of you are going to enjoy that part of it, too. And Hector, tell us a little bit about you and what you love about photography and your role with Sony.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hector Parayuelos. I have been with Sony for about 4.5, almost 5 years now, and I work as a specialist for the Alpha division. And I generally go to the stores, go to our dealers or brick-and-mortar retailers, and just help them out as best I can, train them on new product. And we do a lot of events, prior to what's going on now in person, and now just a lot of streaming events. In terms of photography, what drives me is just, I'm big on adventure. I love traveling. I love just exploring and things like that. And I love cataloging what I do. So I like capturing when I go and I find a new place. I like capturing that in a new light and sharing that with everyone.
Well, and I've seen some of your travel stuff over the years, and you've gotten some really cool stuff and had some good adventures. And you've been to some places I haven't been to yet, because I think you did a big trip to Japan a year or two ago, right? Is that right?
Four times there.
4 times, yeah. See, I haven't even been once, so I'm totally jealous of that. But, maybe I've been to places you haven't been to before. Like, I don't know, have you been to Dubai? I spent a lot of time there. Have you even been? No, I'm just kidding. Anyhow, so all right, well, let's get the conversation going while we're waiting for people to join us and get those questions posted in the chat. We have an avid Sony shooter who's saying hi, everybody, who we've met at the Sony Alpha event we did about a year and a half ago. So good to see you guys here. So there was a new camera announced this week, the A7C. So why don't we take a moment, let's talk about that new camera, what's exciting about that camera, and maybe who's the target customer for that new camera?
All right, so I don't have one. I was going to print out the photo to show, but now we can just take my word for it. Just a quick question for Kate. Am I able to share my screen if I've got some slides real quick?
Yes, totally. Absolutely.
All right, let me put that up. So we announced the A7C yesterday. So if you look at our lineup, we've got the A9, which is kind of the speed, sports, wildlife, journalism camera. We've got the A7R series, which is R for resolution. We've got the A7S3, which we just announced, and that's S for sensitivity. And then the base model A7 is kind of just good all around. A7C, that stands for compact. So we've created a camera that's going to be the world's smallest and lightest full-frame mirrorless camera with an electronic viewfinder. Let's see if we can get this shared real quick so I can show you a photo of what that's going to look like. And I think we're good to go. So let's move over real quick. Bear with me a moment. So this is a new concept for us. We've always had smaller mirrorless cameras, but we haven't really made them smaller over the years, from the A7 to the A7 II to the 3, et cetera, they've gotten a little bigger just as we've needed more space to add things to it. But this is it's basically like we took our full frame camera and put it into the body of one of our APS-C cameras. Still has the viewfinders off to the side like our APS-C cameras, but like I said, I don't have one, but I've spoken with a few of our collective and artists that have them, and they say that it feels just like a completely new being, like something that, if you've shot Sony from the original A7 full-frame mirrorless till now, it feels even lighter and just completely different from that. In terms of the ideal customer for this, I think a lot of vloggers are going to be going after this. There are a lot of features that speak to that segment, including the screen that flips out. Just a lot of the movie features that are inside of it. It's one of it's maybe the 4th camera that has our new digital hot shoe. So that's compatible with 2 of our new microphones, and it basically just is going to give you a lot better audio quality when you are recording. That's the lineup. And one cool thing, which is just, it's aesthetic, but aesthetics are important to some folks, we finally have a slightly different color option for our cameras. I am a big fan of offering things in different colors, and I'm glad we finally have one. We've got this nice kind of silver top. Kind of gives it a retro vintage feel. So, and it's kind of a silly thing to be excited about, but that's something that I'm pretty big on.
Well, as photographers, we appreciate nice aesthetics, and it does give it that kind of vintage, almost film camera look to it, which, as someone who still loves film and still uses film, is something that I definitely enjoy. So it looks like a really nice camera. The size of it and the specs that I've seen so far make it look pretty impressive. Sarah, did you have any comments that you wanted to add in about this the A7C before we start talking about some other stuff?
Yeah, no, I'm actually very excited about the new compact size. It really opens up taking full frame with you everywhere. Right. So I'm excited to kind of throw that in my arsenal and be able to always have full frame in my purse or my backpack or wherever I go.
That's awesome. Now, I do have a question from, I believe it's Reza. It's just got his first initial last name, but I'm pretty sure that's his name. So he's asking, does it have a product photography feature? I'm guessing that you could do any kind of photography with this kind of camera. The camera.
So what he's talking about is the ZV-1 has a special feature where basically if you grab a product, which take my mouse and you put it up real quick to the camera, it will automatically zoom to that. The answer is I don't know. That was actually one of my questions when we had our training. So none of us have had a chance to touch the camera yet. A lot of folks will frequently ask us, hey, is X camera coming out? Is so-and-so coming out soon? We don't know. We find out about the same time as you do. So we're waiting back on that answer. The answer is unclear for now.
Okay. Yeah, because he totally followed up about the ZV-1. So now that all makes sense. Okay, fantastic. So if you are interested in the new A7C, guess what? You can pre-order yours today through Glazer's. Just give the store a call to put your name on that list. And we'll move on to something else. A lot of companies are now doing this because many of us are handling our lives online in a way that we haven't before. Maybe in a way we have before, but we're doing it a lot more. For instance, our anniversary event is normally something that takes place in store, and all of you lovely people tuning in would normally be able to come in and browse and have 2 days of craziness. So we've taken that and spread it out over a few weeks, but with that said, we're doing all of this education online. And so my understanding is you guys now have a way to turn your cameras into webcams. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we have a new utility we released, it's probably been 2-3 weeks now, called Imaging Edge Webcam. So Imaging Edge is basically the name for all of our software. If you look at the smartphone app, that's Imaging Edge Mobile. We have a desktop suite called Imaging Edge Desktop that has a remote, a viewer, and an editor. Imaging Edge Webcam is basically going to allow you to connect your camera, and I'll show you a list of the cameras that are compatible in a moment, to your computer and let you use it as a webcam. So let me share real quick here. Imaging Edge webcam. For now, it's only Windows 10. This is an important note to make. And then this is the list of all of the cameras that are compatible. Honestly, it's a way bigger list than I was anticipating. I thought it was just going to be the last couple of generations of cameras, but they went pretty deep with this. And what it does is, once this is installed, you connect it to your computer, and let's say you start using Zoom, any other software that you use streaming, the computer is going to see your camera as a webcam. You just connect it with the little micro USB cable. You don't need any special adapter or anything. That's it. It's plug and play. I would like to note, because there was a little confusion, it's not a program. You don't open it up and get to play with anything. It's basically just a real nice driver that will let you use your camera as a webcam. So the benefit of this, obviously, is that your camera is going to have a much better quality than whatever webcam you have. You know, I'm streaming on a MacBook. These have great webcams, but it's just night and day compared to when you're using an actual camera with a much bigger sensor and much better quality. And a lot of folks had asked me about this for a long time, and we finally delivered.
Right. I mean, I think all the camera brands are doing that now. And it definitely does, if you're on Zoom a lot and you want it to look a little bit better, it's definitely nicer to be able to hook up one of your nice cameras with a really lovely lens and just get that really solid professional look to your Zoom sessions or whatever platform you might be using. So that's really awesome. I shared a link to that in the chat, so if you're tuning in, you'll be able to do that. But I have a couple of follow-up questions about the A7C before we dive into other topics. Because as I was asking you about the imaging software, guess what? Questions were coming in about the A7C. So one person was curious about the EVF. Do you have any information you could share or specs for the EVF on the A7C?
So it is a smaller electronic viewfinder, and if you've used any of our APS-C cameras, so like the 6400, 6600, it's going to be similar to that. I believe the resolution is pretty close, but because it is a smaller one, it's not going to have, let's say, one of the big things we announced with the A7S3, that it's got a way bigger viewfinder and a couple of options with that. So you got to think of compact. So it is a smaller viewfinder, but from what I understand, it's still high quality. It's still a great, nice, crisp, bright, contrasty viewfinder that we've had up until now.
Okay, great. And what about multiple exposure mode? And so I'll ask this from a couple of directions. So one comment or thought was that exposure bracketing, I'm assuming that this camera would have exposure bracketing.
That's a safe assumption.
Okay. You haven't seen it yet, so we don't know.
95.
But some cameras have a multiple exposure option where you can blend like two photos onto one or maybe even more photos onto one. Do you know if this camera has that kind of option yet?
So back in the day, the Sony cameras up until about generation 2 had something called the Play Memories camera app. So they were apps that were built into the camera that you could purchase and download. Unfortunately, with the version 3 cameras, that went away. Never really got a reason, but I know that we had a brand new operating system for the camera, so I guess it just didn't port over automatically. We've slowly started bringing some of that functionality over. We released a firmware update last year that added an intervalometer, so that replaced the time-lapse app. We don't currently have a way to do multiple exposure. I know I get asked about that a lot, and we let them know, and they know it's something you want, so fingers crossed, hopefully that's something one day will happen, but currently, no, the camera does not have that.
Okay, cool. For now, but who knows what firmware updates can bring you as well, so that's always amazing. I love seeing those firmware updates come in because it just means you're getting more life out of your camera, which is really great.
Yeah. And Sony does a real good job with adding a lot of functionality with the firmware updates.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it really can extend the life of your camera. I mean, you know, we want to upgrade when we can upgrade. Not all of us can upgrade every time, but you know, if we can get a little bit more life out of those cameras that have been around with us for a while, it's always fantastic. At least for me, that's kind of how I think about it. So John is asking about the Imaging Edge webcam software, using it with an RX100 Mark IV. he was noticing that the image quality was maybe a little bit lower than that camera might capture. Are there any limitations to like the resolution output using that software? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so it's outputting at 1080, and as far as I understand, that's the theoretical max that any connection through a USB can do. There are some third-party options, so if someone needed like a 4K connection, you can get, I have an Elgato capture card. There's a bunch of different capture cards you can use if you need higher than that, but most of those connect through HDMI. So there is a hardware limit in what can go over, but you should have good quality unless he's trying to stream higher at a higher bit rate or something like that.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I ran into that myself because I bought one of the fancy capture cards, and between my computer and the card and my camera, like none of it wanted to get along. So, but finally, there's desktop software, and all of my problems were solved. So yay! Well, let's move on. So let's get to know you guys a little bit more, and let's talk about what's your go-to kit. So, Sarah, you talked about you love the idea maybe with A7C of having like that smaller kit that you could just take out for, you know, a day trip or just like a small outing or something like that. So let's talk about what's your go-to kit for, say, because Sarah, I know you do some road trips and things like that. When you do your road trips and do some travel, what's your go-to kit? What lenses and camera body are in the bag to start?
Yeah, it kind of depends on where we're going because we do a lot of off-roading stuff, and that will ultimately have a different kit. Like for that, I will take an RX0 Mark II, which is just a little compact, weather-sealed. Dust isn't going to ruin it. But for the most part, I will take my A7R4. And typically the 24-105 is really my go-to lens. And that being said, I will use a variety of primes. I typically will always take the 55-1.8 with me. That's kind of a no-brainer not to leave it behind because it's so small. I've also started carrying the 24 G Master as well lately, just because it's got that nice, beautiful wide angle and it's great for video also.
All right, cool. So lots of different options. And Hector, tell us about what's your day trip go-to kit? Like if you're not traveling for a month or a week, but you're going to go out for the day or the weekend, what's your go-to kit?
I will be very open about the fact that this answer, you can ask me this every week and it will change, but my current kit that I've been trying to use is the 24-70 G Master, so 2.8 lens, and the 100-400 G Master. I think that covers a good wide range of what I do. I used to also bring a wide angle, but I found myself not shooting with that as much. If I need to go a little lighter, I'll go with the 24-105 and the 70-300, so I drop down to G from G Master, but they're still great quality. You're just missing out on some of the speed in terms of the aperture and stuff like that. For the camera, A7R4 is what I've mostly been using, although I'm really excited about the A7C. I think that's going to come into play a lot for what I do, because even though our system is smaller than a traditional DSLR system, it still adds up. I've got some back problems, so I always try to carry the least amount possible. So you shave half a pound here, you shave a quarter of a pound there, all of that adds up.
Well, and some of the G Master zooms especially are going to be a little bit bigger, a little bit heavier. I know, like, if I were a Sony shooter, I'd have the 85 G Master, just like that would be the be-all, end-all. But I mostly do portraits, so with that said, that's a beautiful lens. I still love that lens. So let's talk about some of the tech in Sony Alpha cameras. So tell us a little bit about like the technology that's helped you the most with your photography. And let's start with you, Hector. Like what's maybe one or two things that are built into the cameras that just really you think help make the process a little bit better, a little bit easier for you?
Okay, so I'll start with something that probably isn't super technological, but it's been an upgrade that we added maybe 2 years ago that's brought a lot of improvements to my life, which is the ability to add star rating to your images. So you go through your images in the camera, and you can add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stars. Very low tech in the grand scheme of things, but it's a simple thing that for me makes my post-processing just a lot easier. for me, the whole idea of having to sit through and call through my images and decide what I'm going to edit, that's probably the worst part of post-processing, and I hate it. But when I'm traveling, I can just very easily go through, if I'm sitting on a bus just waiting to go somewhere else, go through and edit and delete whatever I'm not going to go. So that's the low-tech kind of angle. For the bigger tech kind of angle thing that I like, IAF, so the eye autofocus, we'll can talk a little bit more detail about that in a moment, but for me that's really changed how I photograph, and it's actually made me a lot more comfortable with doing portraiture and things like that, whereas, before I wasn't very into that, and as I started to get excited about portraiture, I just wasn't as experienced with nailing that focus on that eyeball. But that's made a big difference for me.
All right, and Sarah, what about you? Is there any little bit of technology that you're just like, oh man, I really love this?
Yeah, I'd say when we did the firmware updates, probably about a year and a half ago, to the A9, A7 III, A7R3, and that technology is now in the A7R4 and A9 too, but adding in the real-time autofocus and the animal eye autofocus for me is an absolute game changer. I miss so many less shots than I used to, just being able to press that button and it just dials right into the animal's eyes.
And you do a ton of pet photography, especially with your pups. So, yeah. I mean, could you maybe share a couple of tips on pet photography since we're here and we happen to be talking about that?
Yeah.
Two tips. Just keep it simple. 2 tips that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. The best thing you can have on you and I'm going to speak specifically to dogs right now, but having treats or something that motivates them to get the photo you want. So my dogs love food, so we go with treats, but some dogs like a ball or what have you. But you got to have something to have their attention and motivate them. And then I'd say the next step is dialing in your camera so that you can get their eyes in focus.
And you found, it sounds like you found the Animal Eye AF to be a real game changer in the newer cameras for you. Okay,
absolutely. And it works almost every time. So yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. So what other features I've heard about? There's a time-lapse feature. So time-lapse feature, any other technology in the cameras that maybe are buried in a menu that people don't even realize that are there. A lot of times we get a new camera and we start with what we've used before, maybe if we've stayed within the same camera system, or we turn it on, we make the batteries, make sure we've got a charged battery, and we just kind of go for it. We just start shooting, but we don't always dive into the menu. So could you maybe share 1 or 2 things in the menu system that might be hidden, or maybe people might not realize are there?
Best kept secrets.
Best kept secrets. Yeah, good call, Devin.
So one thing that I'll mention, I'm just going to get a slide for it, someone's going to get there. This seems pretty obvious if you know, but I constantly find people that aren't aware of this. So what I'm going to talk about is tracking focus. So I noticed over the years I had a lot of folks would come up to me and be like, you know what, the Sony's, the focusing is great, it works really well. When I'm trying to track a subject, sometimes it works super great, sometimes it doesn't. Through some troubleshooting, what I realized is that they were not actually in a tracking mode, that they were just using the regular autofocus, and it's just so good that it works most of the time. But when you start to track a subject that's moving erratically across the scene, you have a different set of metrics that you kind of need to measure for. So that's one of the most important things that I go into in one of my classes, and in a second I can share my screen to talk about this in a little more detail. So in order to get to this, you need to make sure you are in autofocus continuous, so AFC mode. That just means that if you're holding the shutter button down, it's just going to keep focusing the whole time. And you go to your focus area, and you navigate all the way to the bottom. And the very last one is going to say one of 2 things. It'll say lock on AF or real-time tracking. They're both the same thing, just one is a slightly newer tech. So once you're in lock on AF, and you see on the screen there the cameras that are listed there, use that. This is measuring 3 things. So as soon as you press that button or use the back button focus, it's going to identify your subject. Once it's identified the subject, it's starting to measure their color, the distance between that subject and the sensor, and it's going to recognize their face if it's a human. So it's using these three metrics to follow the subject across the screen instead of actually just trying to figure out focus from scratch every time. That's what a lot of those people that were complaining about the focus were doing. They weren't in an actual tracking mode. Now, last year, we upgraded on some of the newer cameras that have a newer processor and can do more. We bumped that up to real-time tracking. So we added two new metrics that it measures. So on top of the color, distance, and face that it was measuring before, it now will also measure pattern and eye recognition. So if you have a human, it's now also measuring the pattern of, let's say, their face or of their dress or whatever they're wearing, and also their eyes. So this does an even better job of being very sticky. So if you've got that soccer player that you see on there, and they're kind of moving around, it's going to do a much better job of sticking on them. So if you've got a Sony A9, it does 20 frames a second. Those 20 frames a second are useless if they're not all in focus. So we've had to do a lot of improvements to the focusing system and in this with real-time tracking in order to make sure people were getting 20 usable frames per second.
And the technology just keeps getting better and better. So those are some really fantastic improvements in that arena, especially for folks who are doing sports photography, or maybe you love photographing your pets as well, and they never sit still. So that tracking can be helpful with them too, or your kids.
Yeah, and it's also improved to where on the latest generation cameras, the last few that we've released, the tracking in video works even better. And you can engage that just with a tap. So if your touch screen's on, you can just tap on the subject and it'll be able to follow them. And that's been a huge deal, because while we had very great and consistent still photography autofocus for tracking, the video kind of lagged because it's a completely different situation. It's much more processor intensive, but we finally got there and we're starting to release that functionality on the newer cameras.
Well, I mean, and that's just technology in general, right? There's continual updates and improvements, and we find new ways to make things better and smaller. So that's all fantastic. So just a reminder to you guys tuning in, we're having a conversation. We'd love your input and your questions, so don't be shy. Post those questions in the comments on Facebook or in the YouTube chat, and we'll ask your questions too. So I'm going to keep going with what we have put together, but we want to hear from you guys as well. So I just see a new comment. Reza's saying the tracking on the A6600, the R4, the A9 and A9 II, and all of the other new bodies is amazed. Not just amazing, but amazed. So thanks for that input there, sir. So let's shift a little bit and talk about some different things. So Sony makes some really fantastic, especially the G Master series lenses. But I know a lot of people who shoot film, and a lot of people who appreciate some of the lenses from the pre-digital days because of maybe a specific look that lens might achieve. Have you ever done any adaptations or adapted older lenses to Sony cameras and experimented with that at all?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things that really kind of brought the Sony full-frame system to the forefront of a lot of people's just consciousness is that ability to use with third-party lenses with an adapter on our system. So when let's say the A7 original series came out, there were a lot of folks that were just big film buffs that had huge collections of 50 to 100 to 300 old vintage lenses. Now all of a sudden they can use those on a full-frame body, because all of those film lenses, those are all full frame. There was no such thing as APS-C or crop back in the film days. So they were able to use those on a digital body and not have to take the photos, pay to get them developed and then scanned and do all that. So that became a very big part of why we were known. Funny enough, with folks that just were really not into the digital scene, they kind of wanted to stick with their old aesthetic, but now they had a way to kind of bridge both of those. As time went on, some companies started making adapters for autofocus. And, when I came over, I had the original A7, and I came over and I had an adapter. I was using my previous system's lenses, and the adapter for that, they were very poorly performing. They focused very slow. There was a lot of focus breathing. It was not good. But over time, they got better. And what ends up happening now is we're at a point where there are adapters for virtually any lens that has ever existed. Any of the autofocus adapters have gotten much better than they used to be. So if you're coming over from another system, you don't really have to worry about that time where you kind of have to bridge from your old system lenses to your new system lenses. You can still utilize some of those, and some people just prefer to keep those. The one thing to bear in mind, and it's maybe a separate topic to talk about, is that older lenses were built with older technology. So things like the focusing motors and just the glass elements themselves on the inside, they are of very different quality and performance level to what we have now. So while you don't necessarily go backwards in terms of performance using your lens from another company on a Sony, you're not gaining the benefit of some of the newer Sony focusing tech and just what we do with our lens.
Right, but I think there's an aesthetic that sometimes people are looking for when they are using some of that vintage glass on a newer body, because they want to obtain that vintage vibe without maybe editing or things like that. And those lenses can have a different look. And it's just also kind of fun to experiment and play and try different things. So, and if you have the option to adapt lenses maybe you already have to your new camera, it's a great way to like start with something, and then as you build, you buy Sony glass, right? So there's so many options.
For sure. And I lived through that whole process where, when I came on board with Sony full frame, there were 5 lenses, and none of them were really focal lengths that I used. So I was adapting for a while, and eventually Sony came out with their own native versions of some of the glass focal lengths that I use. But yeah, in terms of vintage, it's a little different because, as you mentioned, you can get a very specific look that some people nowadays may get new glass and then run it through a lot of filters in Lightroom or Photoshop to kind of get that vintage look. So
right. Yeah, there's entire companies.
The original.
Yeah, there's entire companies who build, film look, presets that go into Lightroom or Capture One and all those different programs. So, so there's a lot of fun to be had there too in your editing. So Joseph has a couple of questions, and one is, you guys used to make DSLRs. Have you kind of fully shifted into just the mirrorless systems, or because it's been quite a while since you released a DSLR? Do you guys have any insight on that?
Sarah, do you want to grab that, or should I?
I think we can both kind of talk to it. Definitely the technological advances have really been in the mirrorless system, and it's because it's a smaller system where they've redesigned a lot of the parts. But Alpha, in terms of the A-series cameras, they have not gone away. Excuse me. And we did just release the new LA-EA5 adapter to be able to adapt those Alpha lenses onto mirrorless cameras as well.
All right.
What's
for
your
that
perspective, Hector?
Hector, did you have any more?
I mean, Sony has invested a lot of time and energy into developing and furthering the mirrorless. I think that's, we recognize that that's the future. Our A-mount, which is what we call our DSLR-like cameras, they're still technically current. You can still order one. You can still order most of that glass. But if you just look at consumer purchase data, at least in the States, it's been a while since that has been a significant player. People are interested in the future, and the future is mirrorless. As you can see, with a lot of the competition eventually and begrudgingly kind of coming over and creating their own lines with that. But it's not to put a damper on what the product of the past was, because it's still relevant. I still know a lot of photographers that use a lot of that gear. And as Sarah mentioned, we've just released the 5 adapter, which is basically, we've had the version 3 and the version 4, and they kind of had their pluses and minuses, but realistically, they weren't letting the lenses do all of what they could do. The 5 is going to kind of bridge that. We still have a couple of lenses in that E-mount lineup that don't exist on the E-mount lineup, so until that comes out, why not try to help folks that have those lenses be able to use those on the newer systems?
Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's talk about, so sometimes we see these terms in our camera and we're not quite sure what they do. And I know on some of your cameras you have options like HDR and then DRO. So could we talk about, I'm familiar a little bit with the phrase DRO because some of the cameras that I use also have that option. But maybe the world needs a little information on, what is HDR versus DRO, how they work, and let's maybe define that for them a little bit.
The people need to know.
The people need to know. Well, but I mean, that's also the thing that I think is, we can take a deeper dive. This isn't a traditional Sony class or anything where we're talking about this is what this button does. There's some phrases and things in our menu systems that we look at and we're like, oh, I think I know what that means. And we go to the manual and I'm like, I'm still maybe not really sure. So sometimes having someone explain it to us is helpful. So let's talk about HDR and DRO.
Yeah. So DRO is the dynamic range optimizer. So what it does when it takes one image is it kind of pulls a lot of extra details from the shadows and from the highlights. So you get an image with a much better dynamic range. And the cool thing is you can leave it on auto or you can play with the different settings of it. So you can dial it way up if you want to, or you can dial it back and have it be more subtle. I use it quite a bit. I just use it on auto and I let it fly. If I have an image that I want to be more contrasty, I will turn it off. Like if you're doing like spot metering and you've got like a bright spotlight at a concert, then I'll turn it off. But for the most part, I use it and it does a fantastic job.
All right. And then the HDR mode, that was the DRO.
Yep, that is DRO. HDR is high dynamic range, and what that does is just like traditional HDR, where it takes separate exposures, one overexposed, one underexposed, and combines them into one image. I will make a note that on the Sony cameras, you cannot do that in RAW. It has to be JPEG only, and it will combine all the images for you. You won't get the stacked images.
Okay. So it won't save them as separate. It won't save the two extra exposures. It just blends them in camera.
Correct, Hector. It's one. I haven't used it in quite a while, but it's one.
Okay.
With HDR, you keep the blended shot and then the center exposure. So whatever your normal standard exposure is. So you end up with two images, not four.
Okay. So it does. Okay. So does it do like a -1, a 0, and then a +1, or you can go in and set the parameters for how under or overexposed?
You set the level and it'll adjust it around there.
Oh, okay. Cool.
The other thing that I'd like to mention is that for folks that tried DRO a few years ago and weren't happy with the results, kind of like I was, Sony on the back end has improved the quality quite a bit. And I wish we would have talked about it a little more because I hadn't realized it until I started using it. But it's really good to the point where I don't really use HDR for the most part. And realistically, for me, both things kind of work when I'm not going to be doing post-processing because I just shoot in RAW most of the time and I can just bring out the highlights and the shadows and all that.
Yeah.
But a lot of folks are shifting to just doing JPEG and not doing any post-processing. So DRO is a good way to just expand your dynamic range without having to do really any extra work.
Yeah, I know for me, I do tend to shoot more and more in RAW. Because I like that flexibility to pull a bit more out of the shadows because it's just amazing what you can do now. And I honestly haven't played with the DRO that much, so it's something for me to play around with and try again. Well, thank you for explaining those little terms. Like I said, it's nice to kind of dive in and get some of those little random questions answered. So let's talk about camera bags. We all have different tastes and use, and so this will be confession time. I personally have about 15 camera bags. How about you guys? How many camera bags do you have, Hector?
Kudos to Hector's camera bag wall there. I appreciate that.
Oh my gosh. I still have more than that. I have more than that.
Well, I've got about 4 more that I need to sell. But yes, This is my attempt to try to calm it down a little bit.
Okay.
My main one that I use most of the time, unless I have a specific need, is the Peak Design Everyday Backpack. There's some good things and some bad things about it, but for me, it's just really the best of every world possible. I like that I can use it just for going out to play Frisbee and not have any camera gear in it. It's easy to kind of move things around as it is to just actually just throw a couple of lenses in there. Now, if I'm bringing a lot of gear with me, there's other bags that I think do that better. But they really nailed the name. It is an everyday bag for me.
So if you were going to do, and I'm going to ask this because this is the kind of traveler I am, I like to take a month and go somewhere, or 3 months if I can do that. Wow. And I'm the kind of person, I tend to shoot with primes, so my gear I try and keep minimal. So I have a backpack that is not actually made anymore because it's a few years old. But I like to go super minimal, even when I travel on those kinds of trips. So when you're going to do an extended trip, what kind of camera bag would you go for, do you think?
The side point to that would depend on if I'm doing a lot of hiking or not. If I'm doing just a little bit of hiking, a lot of urban travel, that would still be the bag that I bring. If I were doing a lot of intense hiking, I'd probably go with a different bag. So I've got the, I'm going to butcher the name, but I think it's the Loca UL from S-Top and also from Atlas bags. They both have bags that are nicely situated for sitting nice on your back. So they're very lightweight. So that's kind of the priority for me. What's nice about the Loca is that you can just take it's an ultralight hiking bag basically with a camera compartment, so you can take like a metal strip kind of out and just flatten it. But for almost every other trip that I've done, the Peak Design is the one that I've gone with because I don't generally travel with a lot of camera gear. I try to stick to 2 lenses at most, keep it one camera, and just keep it as light as possible. The other thing that I will do, which I was going to mention, is that I've started bringing the Think Tank Streetwalker rolling backpack. So like as I mentioned before, I have some back and neck issues. So with that, it's a roller, so you can just kind of roll it around. But sometimes you end up in situations like in Japan, if you go to any of the shrines or temples, you can't be rolling around luggage. But this has really nice thick camera straps, bag straps, and I can just throw it on my back for those situations. So that might be an alternate answer if I'm going on a long trip, because that will save my back some pain.
Yeah, I know for me, my roller bag is the Airport Advantage from Think Tank. And I use that. I've traveled with that, and then I'll normally carry either a smaller backpack that I can squish into my roll-on bag, or like a day bag with a camera and a lens, or a camera with a single lens on the body, and then room for other things. But that's I love that. I love Think Tank. Their bags are awesome. I mean, Peak Design is really cool too. I actually am adding some Peak Design bags to my collection, but I'm also selling some bags too. Sarah, what about you? Do you have a go-to bag? Like, what's your favorite?
Yeah, guilty as charged. I have a whole closet shelf lined with bags on top.
That's all
the last couple of years, I've really used a couple of Think Tank bags that I absolutely love. I have that little sling bag. I can't remember what it's called, but it's like the 20 or 2.0 or something. I love that. I can stick a mirrorless body and 2 small lenses in it. It was great. And I also do use the Peak Design bags quite a bit. More recently, I picked up one of their little sling bags, and I really like it. Just small for, again, 1 camera body, 1 prime lens. But if I'm flying or traveling up to Seattle or something like that, or we're going up to take photos up there or something, I do take the everyday backpack with me because I can stick my work laptop in the back and then put my body, some lenses, and I can throw some other stuff like a cell phone battery pack and all kinds of other things because it's got lots of room in that little top compartment. So and I've got a couple of old like low pro bags that those are the camping bags, and they do a great job.
I have Mindshift makes a little hiking pack that I got for my gear, and it's got like the camera insert part, and then the top part of it I can put a jacket and snacks, and then there's the side pockets. So that's become my, like, if I'm going to do extended hiking or that kind of thing, I've gotten to use that bag a lot. But I just ordered the new tote pack from Peak Design and the sling as well. So we're having some Peak Design love.
That tote bag, I actually pulled out all the inserts out of it, and when I traveled to Seattle to see all you folks, I put my laptop in there, and there's so much room in there. I don't even use it as a camera bag. I just use it as a tote bag.
Well, and I could see, because you can compartmentalize it to not even do that, or maybe keep one of the sets of inserts in for a small camera, and then water bottles and travel bag accessories. Anyhow, that's one of the things that's nice about so many of the camera bags on the market today, is that you can customize them and really like move those little compartments to fit your needs. So that's the joy right there. We have about 15 minutes left, so you guys, keep asking those questions. We're going to go through our conversation here and talk a little bit more. So one of your questions that you guys, one of the topics you guys sent me, I'm going to hold till the end or for a little bit later. So I'm going to jump around a little bit and throw you guys off maybe. So let's talk about, we talked about this a little bit before. We were talking about shooting RAW, and a lot of people are now doing JPEG. You know, when I think about that, I think about where am I going to use the file, right? RAW versus JPEG, RAW gives me much more latitude. But I would love for you guys to talk a little bit about the difference between a regular RAW file and an uncompressed RAW file. Like, when might I want uncompressed? Why would I want uncompressed? Could you share some insights, Hector?
So, I'm going to start this by prefacing and saying that I very rarely use uncompressed. I use compressed most of the time because I think it does a good job of that. Can't remember which exact camera, but it's been a while now. The first couple of generations of full frames, we didn't have uncompressed. We just had compressed, and it's close to being a lossless compression. You don't really have really artifacts or anything. You're just not getting 100% of the depth. It's a little less, but 99% of people will notice a difference. But that 1% is very loud, as it generally is, and kept asking for it. And Sony's pretty receptive to what people want. And maybe by version 2, I think we started having uncompressed RAW as an option. In terms of the physical aspect of the file, they're going to end up being about twice as large, and you're getting a lot more data. It's not really twice as much, it's just not compressed. And if you're doing a lot of very intricate work, so if you're doing fine artwork where you may need to push the boundaries of what you are editing, that might be a reason to do that. If you're doing any sort of landscape work, particularly anything that you really want to push the dynamic range of the image, I think those are the instances where some people might notice a difference. But I've done A/B tests to people that were, screaming about wanting uncompressed RAW when it came out, and they couldn't tell the difference in files. So I think it's kind of a placebo thing. For me, I've done it mostly in tests, but even in my A/B tests, even when I push my landscape photos as much as I can in terms of editing the RAW files, I haven't been able to really notice a huge difference between the two. So my personal take on it is I just advise everyone just do compressed RAW. If you happen to be doing fine art work exclusively for your job, if you happen to be doing fine art landscape work, check it out. I mean, I'm going to say it doesn't hurt. It does hurt your hard drive space in your cards, but realistically, if you're doing that kind of work, you're probably not shooting 20 frames per second bursts.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, if you're shooting in burst mode with these fast cameras, that might be a good idea, just to stick with the regular RAWs, unless you have really, really, really fast memory cards, right, and really big memory cards. So for those of you guys who might be curious about RAW versus uncompressed RAW, do some testing, look at those images, dig into those details, and figure out which one is best suited for you and the work that you're creating. So some of your cameras go up to a really high megapixel count, like really, really high, like all the megapixels. So if people aren't printing super large format, tell us why? Why do we need all the megapixels? Share why.
You want to grab that one, Sarah?
Go for it,
yeah,
Sarah. Tell us about
I bought an A7R4 specifically for the high resolution, and the reason being is that I don't print anymore, hardly ever anymore. Everything just goes online. It goes on Instagram or Facebook or what have you. But the reason I did it is for the basically for the APS-C crop mode. So you basically can take your 24 to 105 and use the APS-C crop mode, and you get an extra zoom out of that, extra telephoto lens, essentially. So it kind of cuts down. I still have enough resolution to work with, but it cuts down on me having to carry extra lenses or heavier, bigger glass. In the instances where I'm not at an auto race or something where I need that long glass, but maybe we're on a hike and, I don't know, the bear crosses your path, right up ahead, I still have a telephoto, I can still crop in and basically get that extra telephoto reach. I've got, 60 megapixels, so it's plenty of room there to crop in. So
I have a friend who likes to call them megapixels, not pixels, but pickles, but he's a dude. So anyhow, Hector, do you have any insight on that, or what's your take on that?
Same thing. It's nice to have that crop ability. So you can put the camera into crop mode where it'll automatically give you that 1.5 times crop zoom. For me, I just like having that wiggle room when I am editing, particularly nowadays where, if you are sharing to social media, you're probably sharing to Facebook, Flickr, Instagram, etc. And they all have different formats. So like on Instagram, if you try to post landscape orientation, it's a waste because it's so tiny, you can't really zoom in. So 5:4 is kind of the aspect ratio that works there. So a lot of my photography that I export, I'll end up exporting up to 6 different crops, some in different orientations, some just a little tighter depending on what format it's going to go to. Anytime we release a new camera, I test out all of our new cameras. When we release the A9 II, it's a great camera, but then I go to edit the files and I feel really restricted in how much I can zoom in because I forget. It just becomes part of how you edit, and I'll try to crop in more. I'm like, nope, that's it. I can't go anymore. It's basically a different way of shooting, because I've explained this to some folks that are like, well, I don't print, I don't care about cropping. And like, yeah, you don't care about cropping because you haven't had a camera where you can really actively crop half the image out and still have a high resolution thing that you can print later on if you need to.
All right. I've used some of the biggest megapixel sensors out there, and there's also another thing to think about too, is like just that detail. And I do actually still print my work. I haven't done any big prints in a while, I'll be honest. But that is a thing that's always in the back of my mind. Do I want to make a photo book, or do I want to do some large prints? If you're doing any fine art printing, also having those extra megapixels can be super beneficial because of just the detail and the information that's available there for you.
I can help with that. We can make some big prints.
And I know, we need to do that actually. I have sample paper that I haven't even used. Anyhow, so let's talk about crop lenses. So lenses intended for APC cameras being used on full frame cameras. Now, when we first started having digital cameras, my first digital camera was a crop sensor camera because honestly they all were in the early days. And I would take my film lenses and put them on the crop sensor body. But are we doing that today, especially with the Sony lineup, because you guys have such a great lineup of lenses designed for the full frame bodies? Are we adapting or using those crop lenses on the full frame bodies these days?
So one of the nice things about the Sony mirrorless system is that we only have one mount. So it's the E-mount, and that's the same for APS-C cameras as it is for full frame. Now, obviously, the sensor on an APS-C is smaller than it is on a full frame, and that's what really makes the physical difference between what's considered an APS-C lens or a full frame lens. How much of a size of the circle and then the lens itself has to be. If you can make it smaller because you have a smaller sensor, then you're going to make it smaller and lighter. That's one of the reasons why APS-C is generally thought to be smaller. But with that, since it's the same mount, you can use APS-C glass on a full-frame camera. Reasons why you would do that, one thing that Sarah mentioned, she's got the A7R4, so you can throw it into that crop mode, and that 61 megapixels drops down to around 26 megapixels in crop mode. That's more than most standard full-frame cameras. Right. So if you are looking to use that mode, you can get something like the 70-350G lens, which is an APS-C lens, and you're going to get extra reach over the full-frame version of that lens, which only goes to 300. On top of that, it is a smaller and lighter lens. So that's one reason why you might want to use an APS-C lens on a full-frame. The other would be is if you're doing any sort of video work, because even if you have a full-frame camera that you use for video work, a lot of folks, when they are doing video recording, are recording in a Super 35 mode, which is pretty close to crop. So in that instance, you may want to throw, let's say, an 18-105 on your A7R4, because that's a lens that has a power zoom. That's an electronic zoom that's very desirable for having those nice smooth gradient, zooms in and out. And since if you are recording in an APS-C Super 35 mode, then you don't need to use a full frame lens at that point. The full frame kind of version of that lens is, I think, like 6 times as large and heavy and significantly more expensive. So those would be the two reasons why you would use that. Now, if you've got an APS-C camera body, you can use all of the full frame glass on there, particularly if you think in the future you're going to upgrade to that full frame. A lot of our higher end glasses can be made for the full frame, and it's a good way to future-proof yourself at that point.
Yeah, and that's what I did. I never bought crop sensor lenses. I just stuck with the lenses that I'd had from my film days, and then when I would buy new lenses, I would get them with the full frame camera in mind. Even though for many years on multiple camera bodies, I was still buying crop sensor cameras, and eventually I got that full frame camera. So we have just a few minutes left. I'm going to ask just a couple more questions for those of you tuning in. If you have any last questions, now is the time to get that question in the queue. So I'm curious because most of our digital cameras are point and shoots. Then there was DSLRs early on, and there's a lot of people out there that still use a DSLR. Perhaps they like the form factor. The reasons are unknown in some cases. So if for the DSLR users out there, why would they consider going to a mirrorless system? What are the perks?
I have something. I'll mention that afterwards. So when mirrorless first came to being popular, the main thing that people said was good about it is that it's smaller and lighter. When we first started having full-frame mirrorless, that kind of became not really as big of a deal because realistically, while we made the camera body smaller, at that point, we didn't really make the lenses any smaller. There was still just, you can't easily change the laws of physics and light physics in this case. And, eventually we started having some designs like the 135 G Master, the 24 G Master. We started releasing some lenses that are smaller. So that kind of out of the way, there are many benefits to the way that a mirrorless operates compared to a DSLR. And for me, the biggest and most important one is the electronic viewfinder. So in a traditional DSLR, the light comes in through the lens, hits a mirror, that light goes up into another mirror that's by the viewfinder, and then focuses that into your eye. That's how an optical viewfinder works. It worked for many decades, but the downside to it is that it's basically a fancy frame. You don't really have access to any information visually of the image. You don't get to see what you're capturing. The way a mirrorless camera works, since that mirror mechanism is completely gone, that light goes in through the lens and gets right onto the sensor, which then sends that information either to the monitor on the back or to the viewfinder on the top. So the benefit of that is that you can basically see everything through the viewfinder that you can see through the monitor, so you can compose and not have to remove that camera from your eye in order to see what you're capturing. That's one of the most obnoxious parts of the DSLR experience, having to do, I think a lot of people call it chimping, where you take the image, yeah, it's okay. Take an image, yeah, it's okay. I can do a whole 10-minute shoot of someone, change settings, play back images, go into the menu, and not take that camera off of my eye because everything I'm seeing in the viewfinder is what's showing up, same as it's on the monitor. So that to me is the biggest part of the mirrorless advantage.
Yeah, I mean, I know from me personally, when I am doing a shoot, it is really nice to just kind of keep going and roll, and I'm seeing the settings change as they need. Through that viewfinder, and then I'm getting that real-time exposure information, so that's super beneficial.
And before you move on real quick, I just wanted to share, I'm going to share the screen real quick. Since this is part of the Glazer anniversary sale, we are running some special deals. We've got our trade-in, trade-up. Is that what's going on here? Just bonus offer?
Yeah.
Correct. So if anyone has any interest in potentially switching over to Sony, or you're wanting to expand your kits, call in, check in with the folks at Glazers, and they'll be able to get you set up with this. We've got some pretty cool rebate deals that we're running here through the trade-in, trade-up program.
Yeah, so if you have any questions about the trade-in program, it is only for a short time in support of basically our Sony weekend, which we're launching on Thursday, so it's like an extended weekend. But yeah, you could trade in old gear towards select Sony cameras and or select Sony lenses. So maybe you're already a Sony shooter and you're ready to get a new lens, so you might be able to trade in old gear towards that. So give the store a call or come in to ask questions and take advantage of that offer. There's also a couple of promos that are available that you should have received via email if you registered. If not, we're going to send you a little follow-up email after the session just with a reminder about those. And then I have a couple of announcements that I'd like to share as well. But before we do that, Devin's ready to kick me out of here. But I did want to ask, so Hector and Sarah, outside of the events that you do with Glazers, where are there other places that people who are big Sony fans or just want to learn more about their cameras, where can they learn more about their camera besides these awesome events with, us?
Absolutely. I'd say the best resource we have online is the Alpha Universe website, and it's just alphauniverse.com. And it's very cool because there's lots of artisan articles on there that they've written towards what they do with landscape or long exposure, portraiture, weddings. There's lots of videos. Any of our product announcements are launched through there, so you can watch any of those streaming live as they do happen in the future. Hector, do you have any other resources you like to use?
That's going to be the main one, and if you're not following them on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, they're also on there. You don't have to just go to the website. So their Instagram posts a lot of inspirational images, and the Instagram stories have a lot of great content. Like they've not stopped the whole time that everything's been going on this year, so it's a great place to find that. And there's a YouTube page as well, but alphauniverse.com or just find Sony Alpha on Instagram.
Okay, great. I have a couple more announcements, and then we're going to wrap this session up. The first thing I want to let people know about is we just finalized the details on this, and Hector is going to come to Seattle to visit us. Yay, because it's been too long. And what we're going to do is we have a very special first look opportunity for you to check out the new A7S III. So you could book a time. It's by appointment only. There's only a handful of slots, and that's going to be on September 30th. I just dropped the link on the Facebook page and the YouTube channel, so go check it out and register because there's only 8 time slots. You get about 15 to 20 minutes of time with the camera, talk to Hector. We will be practicing cleanliness. Everybody's going to wear a mask. And then we have time in between the sessions to make sure the camera is properly cleaned before the next session. So we got your back, we got you covered, but if you're interested in the new A7S III, this is a great opportunity to see it in person, and then you can, place your pre-order and all that good stuff. So that's September 30th. I just shared the link to that. And before we leave, and then we'll be done for a little while, we're not done for today. We're going to be back at 6 p.m. with the fantastic Sony Artisan of Imagery, Sabrina Deng, who's done a couple of sessions with us over the past couple of years, and is someone I've actually known, I think, for 7 or 8 years now. She is fantastic, inspiring. Her work is gorgeous. And we're going to talk about basically how we can make our portrait sessions look more editorial, have that fashion kind of look and feel to them. So that link I've also dropped into the chat room and on the Facebook page. So go register because that registration also will get you reminders and will get you an email following up with the special promos that are happening just this week for Sony. So lots happening. We have 2 more sessions on Saturday with a different Sony Artisan of Imagery, Thibault Roland, who's a French photographer, but he's currently based here in the Pacific Northwest, and he creates beautiful firearm images using long exposure techniques. So we have 2 sessions with him on Saturday. So if you want to see the full schedule, just go to glazers.com, glazerscamera.com/anniversary to see the full calendar of details. So Sarah, Hector, I want to thank you for your time and all this great information today. For those of you who joined us and tuned in and asked some questions, thank you for your time and energy. I know a couple of people said they had to take off, but we really appreciate it. For everybody who's just, giving us their time and energy. It's just really, we're grateful. So thank you. Glazer is celebrating 85 years this year. It's really, really freaking awesome. And Hector, Sarah, thank you so much. I see you on a big screen over here. So thank you for being here with us today. And like I said, we'll be back at 6 p.m. with Sony Artisan of Imagery, Sabrina Dang.